They won the war. They freed the slaves. They saved the Union. And then, they gave it all back. What happened after the American Civil War wasn't just a failure of politics. It was a catastrophic miscalculation that would poison American society for the next 150 years. Because when the smoke cleared in 1865, the victors made a decision that seemed merciful at the time, but would unleash a wave of violence, terror, and oppression that rivaled the horrors of slavery itself. This is the story of how America won its bloodiest war, and then surrendered the peace. April 9th, 1865. Appomattox Courthouse, Virginia. General Robert E. Lee, commander of the Confederate Army, surrenders to Union General Ulysses S. Grant. The Civil War, America's bloodiest conflict, is finally over. Over 600,000 men are dead. The South is in ruins, and now comes the hardest question. What do you do with the losers? Grant's answer shocked everyone. Confederate soldiers could go home. They could keep their horses for spring planting. Officers could keep their sidearms. No mass arrests, no executions, no war crimes trials. President Abraham Lincoln backed this approach completely. His vision was simple. With malice toward none, with charity for all. Bind up the nation's wounds. Reunite the country as quickly as possible. It sounded noble, compassionate, presidential. It was also one of the greatest strategic blunders in American history. But to understand why, you need to see what the South actually looked like in 1865. Devastated doesn't even begin to describe it. Entire cities were burned to the ground. Railroads were twisted into scrap metal. Farms were abandoned wastelands. The Southern economy, built entirely on slavery, had collapsed overnight, and the human cost was staggering. Nearly 1 in 4 Southern white men of military age was dead. Families were shattered. Communities were hollowed out. Widows and orphans were everywhere. The enslaved population, 4 million people, were suddenly free, but had nothing. No land, no money, no education. Most had never been allowed to learn to read. This was the powder keg that Reconstruction was supposed to defuse. Lincoln's plan was actually quite lenient. Allow Southern states back into the Union once just 10% of their voters took a loyalty oath. That's it. No harsh penalties. No fundamental restructuring of Southern society. But there was a problem. A faction in Congress called the Radical Republicans thought Lincoln was being dangerously naive. They wanted stricter requirements. They wanted to ensure that the freed slaves actually got rights and protection. The debate was fierce, and then, 5 days after Lee's surrender, it became irrelevant. John Wilkes Booth assassinated Abraham Lincoln. Vice President Andrew Johnson, a Southern Democrat who owned slaves, suddenly became president. And Johnson's approach to Reconstruction? Even more lenient than Lincoln's. By the end of 1865, Johnson had allowed nearly every Southern state to rejoin the Union. The requirements were minimal. Former Confederate leaders were flooding back into power. The old guard was returning. Some Confederates did flee. About 20,000 went to Brazil, where they founded a town called Americana that still exists today. Others scattered to Mexico, Europe, and the Caribbean. But most stayed, and they had a plan. They couldn't bring back slavery. The 13th Amendment had abolished it. But they could do the next best thing. Create a system that kept Black Americans in a state as close to slavery as legally possible. They called them Black Codes. These weren't just discriminatory laws. They were a systematic cage. In Mississippi, Black people couldn't rent farmland. In South Carolina, they had to have a special license to do any job other than farming or domestic service, and those licenses were nearly impossible to get. Across the South, unemployed Black people could be arrested for vagrancy and then leased out to white landowners as forced labor. It was slavery with a different name. The federal government tried to fight back. Congress created the Freedmen's Bureau, an agency designed to help formerly enslaved people with education, healthcare, housing, and legal protection. Schools were built, hospitals were opened, labor contracts were negotiated, but Southern whites sabotaged it at every turn. Bureau agents were harassed, threatened, and sometimes murdered. Schools were burned. Teachers were driven out of town. And then the violence really began. On Christmas Eve, 1865, 6 Confederate veterans gathered in Pulaski, Tennessee. They were bored, looking for entertainment, so they formed a social club. They called it the Ku Klux Klan. Within 2 years, it had transformed from a fraternity prank into a terrorist organization that operated across the entire South. Their tactics were designed to create maximum fear. Night rides, burning crosses, beatings, mutilations, lynchings. The targets were black voters, black landowners, black teachers, and any white person who supported them. The message was clear: step out of line, and you die. Between 1865 and 1876, thousands of black Americans were murdered by the Klan and similar groups. Thousands more were beaten, raped, or driven from their homes. And here's what makes it even worse. Many Klan members were former Confederate soldiers and officers, the same men who had just been pardoned and allowed to return home without punishment. The federal government did try to stop them. Congress passed the Ku Klux Klan Act in 1871, giving the president power to suspend habeas corpus and deploy troops against the Klan. Hundreds were arrested. Some were even convicted. But it wasn't enough, and more importantly, the political will to enforce these laws was evaporating. Because by the 1870s, Northern voters were tired. Tired of hearing about the South. Tired of spending money on Reconstruction. Tired of federal troops occupying Southern states. The Republicans who had championed black rights were losing elections. The Democrats, many of whom were sympathetic to the South, were gaining power. And then came the election of 1876. It was contested, messy, corrupt, no clear winner. So the two parties made a deal. Republican Rutherford B. Hayes would become president, but in exchange, all federal troops would be withdrawn from the South. It was called the Compromise of 1877. In reality, it was a surrender. The moment federal troops left, everything collapsed. Southern Democrats, many of them former Confederates, seized control of state governments. They immediately began passing laws to disenfranchise black voters. Poll taxes, literacy tests, grandfather clauses. Within 20 years, black voter registration in the South plummeted from over 90% to almost zero. The system they created was called Jim Crow. Separate schools, separate restaurants, separate water fountains. But separate was never equal. Black schools got a fraction of the funding. Black neighborhoods got no infrastructure. Black citizens got no justice. Lynching became a public spectacle. Between 1877 and 1950, over 4,000 black Americans were lynched in the South, often in broad daylight, often with crowds of white spectators, sometimes with photographs sold as souvenirs. This was the world that former Confederates built when they regained power, and it lasted for almost a century. The failure of Reconstruction didn't just affect the South. It poisoned American politics for generations. The Democratic Party became the party of white supremacy in the South, a position it would hold until the 1960s. The Republican Party, the party of Lincoln, gradually abandoned its commitment to black rights in order to win back white Southern voters. The lost cause mythology emerged, the idea that the Confederacy was a noble cause, that slavery wasn't that bad, that Reconstruction was a corrupt Northern occupation. This narrative was taught in schools, glorified in movies like Birth of a Nation, and embedded in monuments across the South. It took the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 60s, a full century after the Civil War, to finally dismantle Jim Crow. And even then, the fight wasn't over. Because here's the uncomfortable truth. The consequences of that original compromise in 1865 are still with us. So what's the lesson? Maybe it's this. Mercy without justice isn't mercy at all. Grant and Lincoln thought they were being generous by letting Confederate leaders off the hook. They thought reconciliation meant forgetting. But what they actually did was allow a defeated enemy to regroup, reorganize, and retake power. And the people who paid the price weren't the former slaveholders. It was 4 million freed people who were promised freedom, but got a new form of bondage instead. Reconstruction didn't fail because it was too harsh. It failed because it was too timid. Because winning a war isn't enough if you're not willing to win the peace. If you found this video eye-opening, share it with someone who needs to hear this story. History isn't just about what happened, it's about understanding why we are the way we are today. And this chapter of American history explains more about modern America than most people realize. drop a comment with your thoughts, and I'll see you in the next one.